My name is Joe Sodia, and welcome to Conversations this evening. My guest is Maureen Griswold, former Army nurse, journalist, and sister of a Vietnam War casualty. After serving with the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, achieving the rank of captain, Maureen returned to her alma mater, San Jose State University, and earned her degree in journalism. She worked as senior editor for the former nursing magazine, California Nursing Review, and as a medical writer in the pharmaceutical industry.
And that resulted from so many people who wrote and contacted me following an online satirical slam piece I did about George Bush's actual military record. I wrote that back in October of 2003, and the independent news organization called Common Dreams published that. Kind of a funny story because I was sort of the last person who found out they had published it as soon as I had sent it to them. But what happened as a result of that, it is just a little 800-some word story. But what I did with that piece was I was able to hyperlink the reader to the actual Bush documents. Those documents, none of which we were seeing in our corporate mainstream coverage leading up to the war or even back in campaign 2000. So what happened as a result of that article, it was a deluge. I was getting flooded with emails, and I found out that many of them were from veterans, military families. People by going to the internet, not by watching our mainstream broadcast news or reading our mainstream newspapers, were on to the story and had been probably since campaign 2000. Back during campaign 2000, an independent researcher by the name of Martin Helt requested documents from Bush's record. This is, when he was getting ready to run for president. And these were all obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. And they were very revealing, showing he was missing for a year. There's actual one document showing him grounded and suspended from flying, and all of that. And in May of 2000, Walter Robinson, reporter with the Boston Globe, which is a well-established, long-time newspaper, published the story. And the findings, and basically the rest of the media ignored it. It was incredible because it's direct contrast to what has happened with politics before. Clinton's way he avoided the draft was really explored back in when he ran for president in '92. Before that, we had Dan Quayle back in '88. The press really looked into his being in the National Guard in Indiana instead of going to Vietnam. Former Senator Bob Kerrey came out in 2001 that when he was a Navy SEAL, his unit had mistakenly done a raid in Vietnam, and they wound up actually killing villagers. That was called the Thang Phong Raid and Massacre. Kerry had to go on 60 Minutes, do mea culpa, which I think was absolutely sincere, but it was what happened in 2000 was a direct contrast, just a whole polarity as compared to what had happened to politicians in the past. So Bush's military record, that story was basically ignored, buried. Then, of course, 9/11 happened, and then, of course, we wound up, saying Iraq has the weapons of mass destruction. There was that whole buildup. And basically, Bush's military record was ignored, even though as commander-in-chief, he's talking about sending our troops, to overseas for an elective war, no less, and where there'd be death and, sacrifice and all that. It was quite incredible.
Based on distortions and...
Yes, about the weapons of mass destruction.
Outright lies.
Yes, unfortunately. It's remarkable what this little article on the internet did. I mean, again, this was all done through independent media. I certainly would not have ever been invited on a corporate news program.
Yeah,
Look at poor Phil Donahue. He got kicked off of MSNBC right before he went to War of the Wreck because he was daring to try to have some anti-war voices on, and they couldn't have that. I did an article regarding, it was called Captain Griswold Educates Peter Jennings on the Bush Record, and that came out in January of 2004 because Peter Jennings, during one of the first 2004 presidential debates, came out with a statement. Michael Moore, the blabbermouth, he had actually come out and called Bush a deserter when he was at a rally for General Wesley Clark, whom Moore was supporting. And, of course, then the media had to cover the story. You've got Michael Moore live on the airwaves, and they finally had to cover it. So, but right in the beginning of that 2004 debate, I think it was in New Hampshire, Peter Jennings comes out and says, in questioning Clark about it, it's a reckless charge not supported by the facts. What's amazing that Jennings said that was ABC had never done a story about the Bush record. So how he could make that statement, that allegation, when he himself and ABC News had completely neglected the story, was quite something. So I did an article, and again hyperlinking, which you can do with online articles, to the record and everything else. And as a result of that, later on, out of the blue, I got an email from a retired Army warrant officer, Bill Burkett, lieutenant colonel. He's a retired lieutenant colonel who wound up kind of being the fall guy a few months later with the 60 Minutes 2 CBS Rathergate debacle. He was the one that furnished the so-called Killian documents to CBS News, and it turned out those documents could not be authenticated. And so it was kind of ironic, some of the people who showed up. One of the people that contacted me, I had made a reference to, there was actually an Army soldier in World War II was executed for desertion. And a very interesting story, it was written by a journalist, William Bradford Huey, who's deceased now, but he was an award-winning journalist, very highly regarded. And in 1954, he came out with the book, The Execution of Private Slovik, which was news to many people, including Slovik's family. They did not know he had been executed and was buried in a private cemetery in France that was for American criminals in World War II. And as a result of my mentioning Private Slovik in the article about Peter Jennings, I wound up hearing from a publisher back east, Bruce Franklin of Westholme Publishing, and he specializes in military history. And that book, it's an excellent book. I highly recommend reading it, The Execution of Private Slovik. It had been out of print, and because of the times we were in, Bruce Franklin decided to bring that book back into print, which it has been now for 10 years.
Private who was
executed by firing squad
for desertion.
Yeah.
How do you spell his name?
Slovik.
That way people can search.
Eddie Slovik. The Execution of Private Slovik is the name of the book, and then the made-for-TV movie. And I remember seeing the movie when I was quite young, and I think it got the highest ratings at that time of any movie made for television, and it's an excellent, excellent movie. But that's a story that shouldn't fade away from American history.
Yeah.
All of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And I always thought in looking at the mission accomplished spectacle that took place on May 1st, 2003.
Where he was wearing this
Top Gun
pilot flight suit and helmet.
I always thought it was really ironic that the name of that aircraft carrier, out of all the aircraft carriers we have, was the USS Abraham Lincoln. And here, here's this famous quote about, not being able to fool people and dishonesty. So I looked up the quote. And what's interesting is it's not really for sure that Lincoln actually said it. As of now, there's been no one document, say like an old newspaper article that puts him, that place and
that
time.
Quotes him.
That quote. And the thing that kept it alive for all these years, because it began to appear in newspapers, I think like in the 1880s, I talk about it, was actually journalists that kept that alive. It was newspaper editors. And it's just really ironic. But the irony of that whole mission accomplished spectacle that took place, and our press just going nuts and giddy over it, and not mentioning anything about the truth of his actual military record, it just really brings that quote out.
Well, they were complicit.
And it was just right after we went to war in March of 2003, that I actually stumbled onto the AWOL story just by surfing the internet. And initially, when I discovered it, which I talk about in the book, I was the world's biggest skeptic. I did not believe it. And there were 3 huge reasons for my skepticism. One, I was a veteran myself. I knew what the acronym AWOL stood for.
Yeah.
I'd spent time in the Army. I saw people get punished just for showing up late. So I thought, that can't be right. If he went AWOL, his military service record would have been a campaign killer. And the other reason why it would have been a campaign killer is because I'd also been a journalist. That's a juicy story. If you discover something about a political candidate, especially somebody running for Senate, governor, president, and they've got something like this in their past, and you can get the documents and show it, my God, that's a blockbuster story as a journalist. So I was very skeptical. That was another reason to be totally skeptical about it.
Then nobody else picked it up.
Exactly.
At that point.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been a game changer in any political campaign. And the third was, as I mentioned before, how the press had behaved previously with other politicians. That they outed their military record, they confronted them, asked direct questions. So I was the world's biggest skeptic. I initially, when I remember looking at it and actually said, well, I won't say it on the air, but BS, but I said the whole thing for BS, and I said it several times.
Yeah.
But when I realized that one of the sources that I was looking at was referring to the Boston Globe, I thought, I started looking at that. And the next few days I went online and I started finding the records, which anybody could do. But, you had to know where to look for them. And I started researching, and then once I began to see the records, having been in the military myself, having my father was also in the military, I began to sit there and go, holy smokes, if this had been in my record, if this had been in Scott's record, we would have been court-martialed, period. And especially during wartime, to go AWOL during wartime. And so I began to realize it, and then I started really watching press coverage. And then, of course, you watched how the press behaved with the whole mission accomplished spectacle, which was very much staged to seduce the press, and boy, it did. And I began to realize this is what the game is. We're just going to pretend, that the reality here that he went AWOL deserting never happened, and he's this big, tough, macho guy that dresses up, not only as a Top Gun pilot, but he was also often going, to military places wearing his, his flight jacket and that kind of thing. And the press just fell for it time and time and time again. It was just amazing. So what I was seeing was a complete parallel universe with the internet, with independent news. They were reporting it, but you looked at it, and as I said, it was like parallel universes between what we were seeing and fed from corporate news versus what was available from independent news sites. The Nation was covering it. David Korn, Eric Boehlert of Salon Magazine was another one, and then one that really entertains me is Linda McQuaig, a Canadian journalist of the Toronto Star. She could cover Bush's record and report it to, in a pretty mainstream newspaper in Canada.
Yeah.
There was also Greg Palast, who is an investigative reporter. He's so good he has to work, he gets assignments overseas. But he actually, with the BBC television, had a documentary called Bush Family Fortunes, which amongst one of the big segments is Bush's military record. Colonel Burkett, who I'd mentioned before, who wound up being the fall guy in the 60 Minutes piece, had that. And here were people in Europe seeing this about our president, and yet none of this was coming over to us over here in the States. So, you saw good journalism, good investigative journalism with this particular news story being practiced, but not through corporate media. So initially, when I realized what the game was and that our corporate media was lying to us by omission, I was so disgusted. I was ready to just take my San Jose State journalism degree, very pretty thing it is, and feed it to my paper shredder. I had been medically retired since the mid-'90s. I have a spinal cord injury, so I had to medically retire. But I just couldn't believe, it almost was a sense of betrayal. That's what it felt like. And article that I did wound up with my younger brother and then another anti-war activist, Dave Ledesma of San Jose, who also had his brother die in Vietnam. His brother was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for heroism. And there's a picture of us at a huge rally at the Civic Center in San Francisco holding pictures of our brothers, and Dave and my brother Kim holding their folded flags from their funeral ceremonies. I'm in the middle and, mocking the leader of the free world for his military record, and getting quite a few laughs for it because this new silly toy had come out from KB Toys. That was how the satirical slam in my first article in Common Dreams started. I was making fun of that toy.
Tell me about that toy.
It's a doozy. KB Toys, which eventually went bankrupt, they came out, they partnered with a company in China, and this patriotic thing was made in China, and it was
just like most of our flags.
Yes. And this was, I think it's about 12 inches tall. It was Bush, a doll. It was called Elite Action Figure. Totally dressed up like it was in the Top Gun Mission Accomplished thing, and it's fully posable, and I guess you can play with it, if you're inspired by that kind of thing.
With the banner. Mission accomplished.
They didn't have the banner, but you can still go on the internet and see pictures of it. It's a doozy. And they came out with this toy, and elite military figure, and I guess people collect these kind of things. So that's how the article in Common Dreams was a veteran applauds KB Toys, and I actually wrote a so-called love letter to the CEO of the company at the time, Michael Glazner of KB Toys, praising him for this toy. But at the very end of the article, I put a picture of my brother Scott, and I suggest, why don't you do a toy about my brother? And so that, I think that really is what struck a note with people who saw the article and why there was such a huge response. They saw Scott.
Yeah. So this toy was not done tongue-in-cheek as a satire. This was done as a serious patriotic action figure.
Yeah.
Our president.
Yes, as Top Gun, Mission Accomplished, and an action figure, but when he's quite some action figure, considering he went AWOL and deserted during war, that's not quite an action figure.
Yeah.
But and our media went along with it, and then I do have in Mission Abandoned, I wound up having quite an encounter with KGO TV in San Francisco. I'd found out that they were going to sort of do a little funny piece. You know how sometimes they do a comical piece to end the news if it's a happy news day, or they show you baby animals at the San Francisco Zoo and that kind of thing. I picked up from a teaser earlier in the day just the way they worded the teaser, and when they went on camera, to tell you watch the news at 5, that they were going to do a spot about this toy. So I called the station and talked to a guy who told me he was a veteran. And I began to say, you really ought to reconsider not airing this piece that you're going to do, this PR piece for the company, because do you know about his military record? And the veteran said no, and he was very skeptical. And I said, go to a website. There was one central website that really did a good job of consolidating all the information and having the links and all that. It was called AWOLbush.com. It's still out there. I don't know if it's been updated for a while. And basically the guy poo-pooed me, so I called other veterans. I said, you might want to call the station. So I know they got a few calls. So I went over to my mom's house, and I said, let's watch KGO 5 o'clock newscast and see how they ended. I told her what was going on. I was hoping that they'd pull it. They could do baby animals at the zoo or whatever to end their broadcast, that we made an impression. And I had even told the guy, I said, look, I'm a former Army nurse. I'm a former journalist. Also, my brother died in Vietnam. It wouldn't even take you 5 minutes to go to the internet and look and see what's going on. You guys should not be putting on a PR piece about Bush's military record. Sure enough, we watched the newscast. There's my mother. She at that time was in her 80s. Had buried her son years ago. They put it on, and they're giggling. The on-air anchors are giggling, and oh, isn't this cute, and isn't this funny, he. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, these anchors. I don't think the guy that we spoke to at the station informed the anchors. I really don't. I choose to prefer to believe that. But the anchors went on and unwittingly made fools of themselves to so many people in the audience that were onto the story, like I was, and other veterans and stuff. And so I wound up writing a scathing letter and directed it to newsroom management. I'd also been writing at other corporate news and never got responses or anything. It also included pictures of my brother Scott. I know they were all shredded. And to sign off this particular letter, I not only put my veteran credentials, but I put down my journalism credential. I said I graduated in 1983, San Jose State, degree in journalism, graduated with honors. I graduated as a Dean's Scholar. Put it in the mailbox at the post office and thought, oh, it's going to be... By this time I'd been conditioned to be ignored, but I was still going to say what I was going to say.
Yeah.
I thought, go to hell. I really did.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, a day passed. The next day, I got a call at home, and it was from the director of the newsroom at the time, Kevin Keeshan. He now works for NBC News as an ombudsman in New York City. And he sounded very shaken, and he said, we've got to discuss this story. And I thought, oh my God, they didn't throw it away? And he said, everybody in the newsroom has read it, and they're talking about it and rather shaken up. So we wound up actually having probably about a 40-minute phone call talking about this. And I talk about it in the book. I did get a sense of, I said, you guys in the corporate media, mainstream news, why aren't you, doing this? And he says, we'll look like we'll have an agenda. And I said, what do you think mission accomplished and all of this Bush pro-military stuff is? It's propaganda, and propaganda always has an agenda. You guys aren't calling him on this. And so we had a civil discussion. We were not ranting like you see on TV so much, these shows where these pundits just scream at each other. It was a civilized, nice conversation. We had some differences of opinion. But I have to say, Kevin Keeshan, in comparison to everybody else in corporate media, that guy had guts. He had guts to call me. He demonstrated having a conscience. And I was totally amazed. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't think KGO TV ever did a piece like that again, where it was all, doing a piece, say, like the KB Toys piece, which they're actually doing PR, for something like that. I, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think they ever did anything like that again, which is good. With Iraq, I think it's more important than ever for journalism students to really study things that fail and figure out, why did they fail? Why did we have a debacle here? I believe in failure analysis. And I think by looking at these, I kind of do that with the book. I kind of analyze things, why things failed so, why our corporate media failed us so, and why so many in independent media, non-corporate media, got so much stuff right. So I'm hoping that for journalism students, it's a tough field when you've got political forces like this and that kind of thing. I'm hoping that maybe it can provide them clarity maybe in the future when they're working as journalists. Also, fortify them, give them some courage. I mean, basically the mission of journalism is to investigate the truth, investigate it, report it, no matter what the truth turns out to be. And I think that got lost. I think that gets lost a lot of time with the corporate influence on media, corporate ownership of our news. Most of it's owned now by entertainment companies. That's not good. Again, you kind of have to look at, the Washington beltway mindset of the journalists there. They too often wind up becoming buddies with the people that they're supposed to cover. And, you can't really do that and do a respectable job of investigative journalism or of reporting. You're not supposed to, be buddies and pals with the people that you report on. One thing I bring out in when I'm in Mission Abandoned, for instance, back in '92, when Bill Clinton's passed he had been in the ROTC as a student. And then he went over to Europe, and then he wrote to his ROTC commander. And there was all this kind of stuff he did to kind of avoid getting into the draft, because then he decided he opposed the war. But then he says, put me back in the running, because if I want to be a politician, I want to show, it was all these machinations he did, as a young man. Well, that letter leaked. It got leaked during the campaign. One of the parties it got leaked to was ABC News. But you can see this on YouTube. It's quite amazing. Eat your popcorn and watch this. I think it's in 3 parts on YouTube. But Ted Koppel, back in '92, devoted an entire Nightline episode to this big scandal. Bill Clinton had to be there in person. Koppel reads the entire letter on air. It goes on and on and on, and the camera's showing close-ups of Koppel reading, and he's very serious, and then they show close-ups of young Bill Clinton, and then he grills Clinton about it. So this was suitable in '92, but interestingly, in campaign 2000, whereas Koppel and ABC News, there's no reporting. Well, it comes to pass too. You find out Ted Koppel is a personal friend of Colin Powell. Colin Powell winds up, being part of the Bush administration. You have to look at these associations that these Beltway reporters and corporate journalists have with the people they're supposed to be covering.
Seems like they identify with the class of people that they're supposed to be covering. They're wannabes. They want to be invited to the next party. They want to be on the guest list for all these.
Well, I think one of the most telling things, and again, you can see this on YouTube, but it's actually revolting, was the Washington radio correspondents' dinner. I hyperlink to it in the book, in Mission Abandoned. And it's when Bush comes out, they have this thing where the president comes and he makes jokes to the journalist and everything in the crowd. They're at the dinner. And he actually made jokes about the missing weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
And what was the timeline?
This was back, I think, it was after he went to war in Iraq.
After.
And, and it became apparent that there weren't WMDs. We're having soldiers being killed and maimed because they're sent over there on the basis of WMDs. And they actually showed pictures of him pretending to look for WMDs in his Oval Office and saying, you think they're under here, or maybe they're under the desk.
Making a joke
and
about it.
And making jokes about it. And everybody in the audience is laughing along, except, I have to say this, the next morning, David Korn, who at that time was working for the Nation magazine, he now reports for Mother Jones, he wrote an article about how he was sitting there and he was just repulsed and not laughing, and people got on him for not laughing. But I think it goes to show you again this collective mindset.
Sheep mentality.
It was obscene. It was really obscene. But then you also have to realize how many people in this room of Washington reporters and correspondents, how many of them were either veterans themselves or had a member of their immediate family over in Iraq looking for WMDs? Probably nobody. They probably don't even know anybody they don't even have a neighbor, that's associated. When you have to think about it, less than 1% of our nation's population now is in the military fighting these kind of wars. So you really see a disconnect. I mean, it's very, very obvious. But even after criticism began to mount from the public about the inappropriateness of the laughter, CNN was actually live on the air, I think with Soledad O'Brien and someone else. And they started to cover this, and I guess they were showing footage of the jokes that Bush and people laughing. And apparently people were emailing CNN very PO'd, and they were even hearing from the families of guys that were killed over there saying this is inappropriate, this is not funny. And yet, even with that, there were certain members of corporate news that still defended it. They couldn't see why it wasn't funny. Amazing.
A terribly devastating war that these distortions and lies led this country into, and all the people who died, not only on our side, but hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and it is still going on.
It was quite interesting that the Bush Library, they opened it to the public on the 10th anniversary, May 1st of this year, the 10th anniversary of the Mission Accomplished spectacle. And initially, when I heard they were going to do that, I thought, are they crazy? People are going to remember Mission Accomplished. But actually, I think they're crazy like foxes. They're good propagandists, the Bush people. The best in the business. I think they deliberately did that because, as Americans, they're counting on Americans to have amnesia. And unfortunately, there's something about our culture and our society. We get amnesic about our wars. I just know that as the family member of a Vietnam War casualty, and growing up, since the time I've been 15 years old with that reality. And just seeing, how quickly wars are forgotten. Ask people about Gulf War I. They'll probably look at, what's that? When did that happen? Where was that? So I think the Bush people deliberately planned to have the library open on that date. And they knew that the corporate news wouldn't cover Mission Accomplished, so they would cover this library that they've just opened. And then Rachel Maddow did a fabulous piece about how they're doing revisionist history in that library. You go into one room and they have you look at the decisions like why to launch the Iraq War, and you do the decision making. And if you make a decision saying, this isn't a good idea, then they have, I guess it's film, they have one of the people from the administration come on and telling you why you were wrong.
I should say now that at the top of the hour, this is KKUP Cupertino.